story one, The Vanishing Chalet. It was supposed to be the perfect winter getaway for Jessica and her friends. A ski trip in the remote mountains of Colorado, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. They had rented a secluded chalet deep in the woods, a place so isolated that the only way to reach it was by a narrow, winding road that cut through dense forest. The chalet was old but charming, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows that offered breathtaking views of the snow-covered mountains. The group of 5 arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to set behind the peaks. The chalet was just as they had imagined, cozy and inviting, with a roaring fire already burning in the hearth. They spent the first evening relaxing, drinking hot cocoa, and planning their skiing adventures for the days ahead. The first day on the slopes was everything they had hoped for. The snow was fresh, the skies clear, and the runs were exhilarating. By the time they returned to the chalet, they were exhausted but happy. They spent the evening cooking a hearty meal and playing board games before turning in early, eager for another day of skiing. That night, Jessica was woken by a strange noise. It was faint, like a distant whisper, but it was enough to pull her from her deep sleep. She lay still in bed, listening, but the noise didn't come again. She convinced herself it was just the wind howling through the trees and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. They had breakfast and headed out to the slopes again. But as the day went on, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The chalet felt different, colder, even though the fire was blazing as it had the night before. The others didn't seem to notice, so she kept her unease to herself. That evening, the group decided to explore the woods around the chalet. They bundled up in their warmest clothes and set off into the trees, the snow crunching under their boots. The forest was eerily silent. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional rustle of a branch in the wind. Jessica couldn't help but feel like they were being watched, though she saw no one. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was small and dilapidated, the windows boarded up, and the door hanging off its hinges. Curious, they decided to take a closer look. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with broken furniture and rotting wood, but what caught their attention was a large faded map pinned to the wall. It was a map of the area with the locations of various cabins and chalets marked on it. One of the markers was for their chalet, but there was something strange about it. The name of the chalet had been crossed out, and in its place, someone had scrawled the word "vanished" in large red letters. A chill ran down Jessica's spine as she stared at the map. What did it mean? Had there been another chalet here that had disappeared? Or was it theirs that was doomed to vanish? The others laughed it off, saying it was just an old joke, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. That night, Jessica was woken again by the same strange noise. This time it was louder, more insistent, like someone whispering right next to her ear. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. The noise seemed to be coming from outside her window. She got up and looked out, but all she saw was the snow-covered landscape, still and silent under the moonlight. She was about to turn away when she noticed something. In the distance, just beyond the edge of the woods, she saw a figure standing in the snow. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person, standing completely still, staring at the chalet. Jessica's blood ran cold. Who could it be? They were miles from the nearest town, and no one else should be out here in the middle of the night. She watched the figure for what felt like hours, but it didn't move. Eventually, she crawled back into bed, too frightened to wake the others, and pulled the covers over her head, trying to block out the image. The next morning, she told her friends about what she had seen, but they dismissed it as a dream or a trick of the light. Still, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over. As they prepared to head out to the slopes, they noticed something strange. Their tracks from the previous day had disappeared. The snow around the chalet was undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in days. Confused, they decided to go skiing anyway, but Jessica couldn't focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the figure she had seen in the night. When they returned to the chalet that evening, they found the front door ajar. Inside, everything was in disarray, furniture overturned, cupboards open, and their belongings scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had ransacked the place, but nothing seemed to be missing. Panicking, they tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal, and the chalet's landline was dead. They were completely cut off from the outside world. That night, the noises returned, louder and more frequent. It sounded like footsteps, whispers, and even faint laughter echoing through the chalet. Jessica and her friends huddled together in the living room, too terrified to sleep. The hours dragged on, and the noises grew more intense until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on them. At dawn, the noises suddenly stopped, and the chalet fell silent. Exhausted and on edge, they decided to leave immediately. They packed up their things and hurried to the car, but when they reached the spot where they had parked, the car was gone. There were no tire tracks, no sign that it had ever been there. Desperate, they began to walk down the road, hoping to find help. But as they walked, the forest around them seemed to change. The trees grew thicker, the path narrower, until they realized they were no longer on the road but deep in the woods, with no idea how they had gotten there. Panic set in as they tried to find their way back, but the more they walked, the more lost they became. Hours passed and the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing was their chalet, but something was wrong. The chalet looked older, more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for years. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in, and the door hung off its hinges. Terrified, they backed away, but it was too late. The same figure Jessica had seen in the snow now stood in front of the chalet, blocking their path. It was closer now, close enough that they could see its face, a pale, hollow-eyed visage twisted in a sinister grin. The last thing Jessica remembered was the figure reaching out for her, its icy fingers brushing against her skin, before everything went black. When she awoke, she was lying in the snow, alone, her friends were gone, and the chalet had vanished. In its place was an empty clearing, the snow undisturbed except for her own footprints. She never found out what happened to her friends or the chalet, but she knew one thing for certain: something in those woods wanted them gone, and it had succeeded. Story 2, The Curse of Avalanche Ridge. Mark and his buddies had been planning their ski trip for months. They were a group of avid skiers, always chasing the next thrill, and this time they had set their sights on Avalanche Ridge, a remote mountain range in Canada known for its challenging slopes and breathtaking views. The warnings had been clear: Avalanche Ridge was dangerous, unpredictable, and not for the faint of heart. But that only fueled their excitement. They were experienced skiers, and they weren't afraid of a little risk. They arrived at the small mountain lodge at the base of the ridge late in the afternoon. The lodge was rustic with creaky wooden floors, a crackling fireplace, and walls adorned with old photographs of skiers who had braved the ridge before them. The lodge owner, an elderly man named Harold, greeted them with a somber expression. "Are you sure you boys want to go up there?" Harold asked as he handed them their room keys. "Avalanche Ridge isn't like other mountains. It's got a mind of its own." Mark and his friends laughed it off. They had heard plenty of ghost stories and urban legends about cursed mountains and haunted slopes, but they were here for the thrill, not the folklore. The next morning, they geared up and took the lift to the top of Avalanche Ridge. The view was spectacular, with endless stretches of untouched snow and towering peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. They spent the day carving through the powder, the rush of adrenaline making them forget Harold's ominous warning. But as the sun began to set, the mood shifted. The wind picked up, howling through the mountains with a ferocity that sent shivers down their spines. The sky darkened and thick clouds rolled in, obscuring the sun. They decided to make one last run before heading back to the lodge. It was on that final run that everything went wrong.